Okay, so the final section in this lecture is going to be about communicating with upper management and conflict resolution. So we're going to start with communicating with upper management. We're communicating with people now who outrank us in the organization. You generally want to be more formal when you're communicating upward. You want to be straightforward without being rude. So communicate clearly. Don't talk around your point, but without being rude. And be courteous, but not obsequious. Don't just, be really careful about being trying to think of a polite way to say this. Obsequious is the best word. I'm sure that you can think of other synonyms for that. So, but we want to be polite and respectful. We want to use assertive communication. So you should use assertive communication also when you're speaking with people above you in the chain of command. You should always remain calm, use I messages, focus on the behavior rather than the person. So if there's a problem, you want to focus on the behavior. Say you've had a conflict with a nurse in another department. You could go to your manager's office and say, you have got to do something about Sally. She always sends up patients with half of her report. She didn't tell me about this and that, that's not really an appropriate way to communicate with your manager, but also it's not very effective at dealing with your issues. So when you're going to communicate that to your management, first, you might try resolving that issue with the nurse in the other department. But if you need to take it to management, you can say, I'm having an issue. Whenever I receive a patient from Sally in the emergency room, the report I get does not seem to match the status of the patient, and give specific examples. So you're using I messages, you're focusing on the behavior rather than the person, and understand that passive, aggressive, assertive pattern. So remember that the passive person allows other people to violate their boundaries. An aggressive person violates the boundaries of others. An assertive person defends their own boundaries and respects the boundaries of others. Some guidelines for communicating with a supervisor: keep your supervisor informed. If you have projects or assignments you're supposed to be working on, keep your supervisor informed of those. If you detect a problem developing, gather information and have some possible solutions developed and present that to your supervisor, especially if it's something that could come along and cause them an issue later. If you give them a heads up and some possible solutions, that really benefits both of you. Avoid assigning blame, exaggerating, or using dramatic word choices. Do not initiate conversation when you're angry, and do not respond to a conversation when you're angry. Project ideas should be presented as a written proposal. It's a good idea to always keep dated records of those as well before you present them. Accept feedback and learn from it, whether you agree with it or not. All feedback is not accurate, but all feedback should be considered, and follow the chain of command. Don't jump over people's heads to go to the next person until you've addressed the person at that level. The last thing I want to talk about briefly is conflict resolution. There is always going to be conflict in any workplace or in any profession. There are different ways that conflict can be resolved. Some of them might be appropriate at sometimes and not at others. Accommodation is giving in. And, back to our two nurses want to use the same computer. If one of them just gives in, that's really not a big issue. It's not a big deal most of the time, and it can keep the peace. So accommodation wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea at that point. But if there's a conflict about whether or not a patient is stable, then giving in could be dangerous to the patient. So accommodation is giving in. Avoidance is denying it or ignoring it. That's almost never a good idea. Address a conflict, deal with a conflict. Competition is, I'm going to prove that I'm better. Compromise is when both people win some and lose some. So we're getting better, but collaboration is the preferred method of conflict resolution, when the people that are in conflict get together, express all their needs, and figure out something that works for everyone. Okay, that is the end of your first lecture in transition. I will see you in class.